Hello everyone, I'm here again to analyze one of the best games of the decade. For now, I have since covered the bugs in the bots, and so the time has finally come for the ILLUMINATE to join the ranks of the analyzed. As with the rest of the factions in this game, they display a level of advancement that's beyond your average generic old alien faction. As you may have seen in a variety of popular YouTube videos, there are certain details in the animations of the enemies that give hints toward their inherent nature. It is these details and more that we will be discussing in this video, so with that being said, this is a biological analysis of the ILLUMINATE.
I know these heinous crimes do not rattle your resolve, Helldiver. I see the vengeful fury that burns in your heart.
Injury? What injury?
Let no temperance stay your hand till justice is rightfully served.
So, let's start with what we know about the ILLUMINATE, colloquially known as the Squids and scientifically called the Squith, as a baseline. Originally an aquatic species, they have become a civilization which has lasted several hundred thousands of years, much longer than humanity's time as an organized civilization. Because of this, they have had ample time to develop a wide variety of advanced technology far beyond that of human capability. And of course, because of their great technology, humans just had to go to war with them. The story goes that the ILLUMINATE and the Federation of Super-Earth met as factions that were initially neutral towards each other. However, after a while, the Federation had noticed that the ILLUMINATE had access to a great amount of weapons of mass destruction, and thus Super-Earth saw this as reason enough to declare war upon them. However, of course, knowing the Federation of Super-Earth, it is likely that, rather than being out of a fear of mass destruction, which, as far as we know, the ILLUMINATE never intended on acting upon, it is likely that Super-Earth saw the alien race with far superior technology and decided that sharing wasn't going to be an option. This is exemplified even more by the fact that, following the end of the First Galactic War, the ILLUMINATE were made clear to have been forced to forfeit all of their technology that, and I quote, could be used as weapons to the Federation of Super-Earth. Following this, the ILLUMINATE were essentially eradicated, pushed to near extinction, with only a few groups of survivors fleeing into unknown space. Now, in the Second Galactic War, we can confidently say that the ILLUMINATE that are attacking us are in fact very malicious. While in the First Galactic War, it seemed that the ILLUMINATE may not have initially been hostile, in the second it had become clear that the ILLUMINATE have their intentions set on revenge, most evident by the fact that they abducted millions of people to turn into mindless freaks, but we'll get to that in a bit. The fact is, similar to the automatons, the ILLUMINATE seek revenge for the wrongs that the Federation of Super-Earth enacted upon them in the past. And so, with that being said, as always, I've created a diagram to show the positions of all the units and where they fit into each other. As you can see, the roster is quite small, as the ILLUMINATE, as of yet, have not been fully expanded upon. Nonetheless, they still prove a formidable foe, and an interesting force to study. With that being said, we start with the brunt of the ILLUMINATE forces, the Voteless. Voteless is the colloquial term used to describe the individuals that the endless waves of mutated humans are composed of. This name is obviously satire, but I assume that in the universe the soldiers and citizens take it completely seriously. And that's probably because they are actually really dangerous. When it comes to playing as Helldivers with access to all that special tech and really just a bunch of ways to defend yourself from smaller threats like this, they are pretty easy to kill. However, it should be noted that taking armor into account, a Voteless can end a Helldiver's life in about 3 to 4 swipes. One could imagine that a single Voteless would have no problem tearing through a small crowd of unarmed or even lightly armed civilians. The source of this strength found in the Voteless seems to be the result of some kind of forced mutation, induced by means defined by Super Earth as Illuminate experimentation. It is not apparently clear what the purpose of this experimentation is just yet, but as we reach the later stages of the Voteless mutation, I will form a hypothesis based on their appearance. What we do know about this mutation is that it somehow allows its victims to somewhat retain their consciousness. We see in certain animations that the citizens taken over by the Voteless in their last moments will engage in deliberate gestures like saluting to the Helldivers that neutralized them. This may also imply that many victims are aware of their situation and are grateful to said Helldivers that they salute to for removing them from it. The reason for retaining of consciousness, I believe, is linked to the reason that the Voteless exist in the first place, but first, on the appearance of the Voteless, the light variant most evidently has its two hands replaced with two large claws. These claws appear to be somewhat fragile, in a way kind of soft like flesh, but make no mistake, it appears that these claws are supported by substantially dense bones. As I explained earlier, they kill Helldivers quite easily. Aside from this strength, the mutation that the Voteless have undergone has caused their skin to become moist and slimy, almost permeable. These are the properties that can also be used to describe the skin of many amphibious and aquatic animals. One such animal whose skin appears similar to this is the squid, or more generally, cephalopods. With that context, the fleshy appendages that make up its fingers start to make a lot more sense, seemingly being tentacles of some kind. Aside from that though, we see that the early stage Voteless have some kind of mask covering their face. This mask could be a growth induced by the mutation, but rather than that, I believe that it might actually be a mask that was implanted onto the Voteless before they were mutated in the first place. The mask itself does have some attachments that allow the victim to breathe, however, they are styled a lot more like gills, in keeping with the Illuminate's overall aquatic theme. Finally, we have the eyes, which are bright blue, as if they were somehow replaced with LEDs, and I honestly have no idea why they are like this. It could be possible that maybe the inside of their head was implanted with something that generates light, or maybe the mutation just does this, being some kind of bioluminescence, or maybe they're compound eyes or something, but I'm not sure why this would be necessary in any way, as it only really serves to make the Voteless more easily spotted by hostile forces. The Voteless mutation is one that is gradual, one that comes in stages, and what we've seen so far, as hard as it may be to believe, is merely an early stage of an alteration that will eventually run much deeper, and so we move on to the next stage of this mutation, one I've simply dubbed the medium stage. What we immediately notice about the medium level progression of the Voteless mutation is, of course, the flesh that the Voteless is composed of has grown a considerable amount. This may show us that the mutation that the Illuminate have caused in what used to be these people seems to multiply cells. In a way, it seems to operate like a cancer, where the DNA of the victims have been altered and the many limits of cell proliferation removed. This is also evident in the claws, which have grown to be much longer and still surprisingly sturdy for their fleshy appearance. Another development in the medium Voteless is the mask becoming seemingly slightly larger and notably being dug into the victim's nostrils. As I mentioned earlier, the mask has openings that are styled like gills, which allow for the unit to breathe, and this essentially cements the idea that the Voteless have in some way been implanted in a way that reaches deep into their circulatory system, or alternatively, the mutation may be designed to merge with the mask after a certain point of development. This second theory is definitely supported by the fact that, draped over the mask, we see what appears to be tentacles of some kind, or at the very least, at this point in development, some fleshy tendrils. We never find out the reason for this, although it is in part the reason why the Illuminate have been assigned the colloquial designation of squids, and of course that their main species is literally called the squid. And so that brings us to the final level of the Voteless mutation, which is of course called the heavy level. One would assume that this level shows the Voteless fully realized, but I don't think that's the case just yet. We see, as described before, the tissue has rapidly proliferated, almost entirely encasing the top half of the victim. And as for the face, we see it as completely developed into some kind of Cthulhu-like abomination. the mask is by now completely submerged into the Voteless flesh, with the tentacles on the face being fully developed. Additionally, for some reason it opens some kind of third eye, the reason for which is completely a mystery to me. Otherwise, everything else that has been said about the previous iteration subsequently applies to this one. Now, another thing about the Voteless that we may analyze is their actual in-game behavior. Due to their nature as cannon fodder, we see they will relentlessly charge toward hostile units, retaining only their basic motor skills and their consciousness, but easily being knocked off balance with ballistic weapons. Obviously, these units are meant to be chafe, but I believe that this was not actually their intended purpose. See, the Illuminate were fairly pissed after their near extinction at the hands of Super Earth. Rightly so, and so it's with this in mind that I form my theory as to what the Voteless are. See, as the few Illuminate fled, their first priority was, of course, to repopulate their numbers, but of course, this also came with a burning hot rage toward the Federation of Super Earth because of what they had done. It's because of this that they wanted to find a way to increase their numbers quickly so that they could lead a new army to Super Earth. I believe they chose to do this by secretly abducting Super Earth citizens to experiment with the human genome, to see how they could get to replicating the Illuminate species, the Squith themselves, using only the other intelligent and sapient life forms that they knew of. If you think about it, in their situation, this makes a lot of sense. Even with breeding camps, reproduction to numbers that would allow for a large army to match the Federation would take far more than hundreds of years, maybe even thousands, and that's assuming that most individuals live decently long. With this method, the Illuminate could have an army up as soon as they figured out how to convert humans to Squith, but here's the thing. I think they actually never figured it out. I think the truth is, the Illuminate were actually going to fail this from the very beginning, as they only managed to create hostile abominations. However, instead of slowly dying out in deep space, an opportunity presented itself. The Federation of Super Earth had carelessly opened a wormhole using stolen Illuminate capability, that being dark fluid, and as a result of this mistake, they took that window of opportunity with what they had, and settled for herding the abominations as if they were some kind of cattle, and using them as their primary force. And of course, while they were working on that project, they also made significant advances in their vehicular technology, something which probably developed much faster. And so there it is, that's my theory for the Voteless, and the overall state of the Illuminate, and it's the one that I'll be using as the basis for the rest of this video. It does have some plot holes, but at the very least stands on its own as an interesting concept. Now, with this experimentation, there probably came many failures, one of these likely being that humans aren't made up of enough matter to match the structure of the Illuminate, and so I assume that in an attempt to find a solution to this issue, the Illuminate tried merging multiple humans with this mutation. However, they didn't exactly lead to the most favorable result. However, it still found its own role in that of the Fleshmob. Now, this abomination seems to be a combination of many humans that have been merged through some process, seemingly in an attempt to perfect the mutation. However, this seems to have gone wrong. Horribly wrong, making the Fleshmob into less of a powerful being and more of a body horror movie antagonist. As you can see here, there's a good reason why I put a small warning on screen, because while we don't really pay much close attention to this thing when we're blowing it up with explosives, when we look at it up close like this, it's actually very gruesome. Aside from this reality, however, there is nothing really new about its appearance that hasn't already been said about the original Voteless, as we've already covered things like the reason for their existence, the cell growth, the dense bone structure, and even the behavior, as it's almost identical. However, an interesting feature about the Fleshmob is that it appears to have also included a cow in its creation. We see near the center of the Fleshmob a gruesome fusion between two individuals and a cow, with the Voteless flesh being thinly veiled over their skulls. The upper human had its ribcage fused with the top of the cow's skull, which has itself been merged with another human skull to its left. Additionally, in a pretty gruesome sight, coming from within the left skull, there is what I believe to be the same cow's tongue hanging out. Now, why there's a cow mixed in there, I have no idea, but I do have a few theories. As for why it could be there in the actual lore, I think it's either to see if including a cow's DNA and body structure with human DNA would produce a better result. Clearly not. And as for why it was actually designed this way, it was probably to play into the trope of aliens and flying saucers abducting cows and all. Assuming this was intentional, it's actually a pretty smart nod from the developers in keeping with the part of the Illuminate's themes that invoke the classic flying saucer type of aliens. Overall, the Fleshmob and the Voteless as a whole are one of the most characterizing parts of the Illuminate forces. However, they are only one part of their thematic design, with the next being introduced in our next unit, the Watcher. Now we move on to the real marvels of Illuminate technology. The Watcher showcases this phenomena by having the ability to hover without any kind of real thruster. It really just floats around as a kind of drone, using some kind of possibly dark fluid-based technology. What's more is that most squid tech is seemingly biomechanical in nature. We see all Illuminate vehicles thus far bleed as they die, including the Watcher. This leads me to the belief that all of these so-called vehicles are actually the same as the Watcher itself, being, in a way, drones, although for the sake of simplicity, after the Watcher I will be referring to them as vehicles. Now, the Watcher itself is nothing extraordinarily special aside from its ability to float. It's a sleek marvel of engineering made from some kind of cement-like material. Obviously, that's not what it really is, but when I look at the stuff Illuminate tech is made of, I just think of cement and stone, like marble. But if you can identify the precise material this is, please let me know in the comments. Aside from this, we can also notice a large variety of small details, such as there being not just one, but actually a wide array of 16 small lights around the big one, and some minor grooves along the sides of the main body that I'm not too sure the purpose of. They're probably related to some kind of aerodynamics. Now, of course, there's the main feature of the Watcher, the central light that it uses to search for hostile targets. At a distance, it appears to shine a purple, rotating light at anything that it perceives as a hostile threat, which, of course, in this case, is the Helldivers. I don't know why it needs this light, as even at night a Helldiver is pretty easily spottable, and it would be more effective to call in reinforcements without shining a giant light, but I suppose we could write it off as it needing absolute confirmation, or not having integrated night vision, or just something like that. Otherwise, there's nothing else special to be said about the Watcher. It's really just a floating piece of Illuminate technology, the creators of which we'll be getting to now as we finally reach the actual squith in the form of the Overseers. Now we finally observe the Overseers. They are described as centuries old, which of course implies that many of them remained from the First Galactic War. However, this poses an issue because the Overseers here seem to be biologically diverted from the way the original Illuminate looked. When we look at the First Galactic War's Apprentice and the other Illuminate units, the face is built like one large compound eye, being a kind of cyclops. However, modern-day Overseers seem to have developed heads, necks, and a slimmer frame. The reason for this is as of yet unknown. However, many theorize that the Illuminate went through rapid evolution during their absence, which is a possibility, but of course unconfirmed, as we don't really know if they went through the necessary selective pressures to undergo such an occurrence. Another proposed theory is that the Illuminate, using their biotechnology, extensively augmented themselves to the point where they began to appear like a different species. This is supported by the fact that the Overseer's armor is seemingly fused directly with their flesh. However, it again has no direct in-game confirmation. As for the appearance of the Overseer itself, it, as I mentioned, has plates of armor fused into it. When this armor is stripped off, I believe we see the Overseer's bare flesh and no skin. Initially, I'd assumed that this was actually its skin, due to the appearance of the squith in Helldivers 1. However, the Illuminate leaks have since proved otherwise. The Illuminate body structure is seemingly somewhat like an exoskeleton. In fact, it shares a great appearance with the xenomorph of all things, with a bunch of patterns across its flesh reminiscent of H.R. Geiger's work. The purpose of these is unknown to me. As one would expect, we aren't really that aware of the specifics of internal Illuminate biology. However, I can assume that these are the markings of some kind of veins or arteries, and, of course, the structure of their muscles. Now, based on the appearance of the Overseer's muscles and the fact that they literally bleed the color, we can assume that purple or blue is the natural color of blood in the squith species. And of course, in the wild, we find that blue blood, or hemolymph, occurs most naturally in marine invertebrates. This is due to the presence of copper containing a protein called hemocyanin. As the process goes with hemoglobin, hemocyanin will turn a certain color when bonded with oxygen, blue in this case. This is a nice detail to show that they originate from a marine environment, and also a detail that we'll be expanding on later. Moving on to their armor, it's seemingly made from the same material that the Watcher is made from, with a variety of attachments and augments to improve this suit. This may support a theory of Overseers being significantly modified squith units, and the overall idea of the squids being a biotechnological race at this point. Among the many modifications, we see some kind of tubes between the squid's thigh and calves, one at each of their shoulders, one going from their biceps to their forearms, and lastly, a bunch of tube-like structures around its neck. I'm not too sure of the purpose of these. They may be used in some way to power the Overseer's armor or shield, or they could just be a property of their armor as a whole. Another kind of modification that we see in its armor are these little joint things that imply that something has been injected or implanted into the Overseer's flesh. While we can't exactly see it with the torso because it causes too much damage when the armor is removed, we see that when the leg armor of the Overseer is removed, we see some kind of indent in its flesh. I assume that these are some kind of implants that enhance the Overseer's physical ability, as they are positioned at somewhat important locations for physical activities. What's more is we see a large bar of the same color at the center of the Overseer's back, the purpose of which I am completely unaware of. Finally, a nice feature of the parts of the Overseer that are more heavily armored is that they have some kind of different material making up some parts, and presumably the underlayer of all parts of the armor. What this other material is currently unknown. Now, the Overseers have a host of technologies that they use for personal defense. One of these weapons being what the Helldivers wiki alone has dubbed the Pathfinder Light Spear. This weapon seems to work on some kind of magnetic force, where the center attracts the two bludgeon pieces but also slightly repels them so that they remain a certain distance from the center. Ordinarily, the Overseers will simply use this end to bludgeon any threats. However, this weapon is also capable of firing a plasma projectile that can penetrate through some heavy armors. Aside from this though, there is a variant of the Overseer that is dubbed the Elevated Overseer. This unit only has 3 new additions: a helmet, a new weapon, and of course, a jetpack. The helmet follows a different and honestly cooler design that kind of calls to the design of Isaac's helmet in Dead Space. I assume that this helmet is of ceremonial value, but it could also contain something like an alternate user interface accounting for the increase in elevation. The weapon, which the Helldivers wiki alone has dubbed the Plasma Storm Rifle, uses ILLUMINATE technology to fire 7-round bursts of baseball-sized plasma projectiles, which, again, the Helldivers wiki alone states burn hotter than small stars. There's also the main jetpack, which seems to be composed of a power source and 2 thrusters. Interestingly, it also has the blue lines seen on the back of the standard Overseer, but much larger. This shows that the Overseer naturally has a power source built into its armor, and that the jetpack is in fact an extension to this power source. Despite this, the Elevated Overseer is much frailer than its standard counterpart, with 150 less health, and on top of that, it is very vulnerable as its jetpack can easily be targeted and blown up. Even with these limitations though, the Elevated Overseer is still known as one of the most annoying Illuminate enemies, primarily because it moves around a lot and it's really hard to hit with really any weapon at all. And if that wasn't enough, the Elevated Overseer will also spam grenades at Helldivers to blow them away every chance it gets, which, you know, isn't the greatest of experiences, but overall, it's really a mid-tier variant of the Overseer. It's not anything crazily special, it just happens to be very annoying to fight against. The other variant of the Overseer is called the Crecent Overseer. The only 2 additions that this one has is the ammo pack and what the Helldivers wiki has dubbed the Plasma Bombard. This is the heaviest weapon in the Overseer arsenal, with level 5 penetration. It will use this for two primary purposes, the first being as a mortar, as it will fire large explosive charges at a distance in order to suppress and kill Helldivers who they and their herds of Voteless cannot reach. The other use for it is as close quarters defense. While it is a bit more dangerous, the Crecent Overseer will not hesitate to use its mortar device at close range. And finally, while I have not witnessed this firsthand, it is also said that these Overseers will straight up punch Helldivers that get just a bit too close. Now, you've probably noticed that up till now, I haven't really covered how all of these pieces of Illuminate tech work, and the reason for that is simply, we don't know. Of course, we are already aware of things like dark fluid and such, but we really can't say for sure if this is even used in most of these weapons. Some even speculate that the Illuminate operates with forces of the arcane as opposed to any kind of standard technology, although that is unlikely. If I were to speculate, I could compare the Illuminate weaponry to the weapons of the Covenant of Halo, which use magnets to shape plasma into bolts and fire it off. And the magnetic hammers that the Overseers use could support this, but ultimately, we have nothing directly confirmed with Arrowhead themselves, although at this point, that can be said about most information here. Now, the Illuminate are a powerful force, and up till now, while we've seen our fair share of power, we haven't really gotten to what makes up the bulk of the Illuminate's lethality. That is, until now, as we move on to our next unit, the Harvester. The Harvester is an autonomous tripod with a single eye and a large energy shield. From its eye, it fires a blue beam that vaporizes everything in its way, presumably using similar methods as the elevated Overseer's plasma storm rifle. Aside from that though, I believe one of the more interesting features of the Harvester that we can observe is actually its legs. See, on these legs, there is inscribed writing that appears to be in the Illuminate's language. Now, I've found a few Illuminate alphabets that do line up with each other, however, they translate to what I see as gibberish. There's a good chance, however, that this is from a language that is not English, as there are two missing characters that have not been defined by these alphabets, which is why I think it's possible that this is Swedish, as with some of the automaton writing. The problem with this is, I don't know a lick of Swedish, and what's more, the Illuminate use a Caesar cipher, meaning that all of those letters I showed you don't actually mean anything because every letter has to be shifted a certain amount of letters in the alphabet. Because of this, it would be appreciated if any Swedish speakers could run these through a Caesar cipher, as it would be easier for them to automatically recognize a word due to the phenomena of typoglycemia, which I'll put on the screen here. And as for the text, there is also some on the head, so in total, we have this phrase on the leg, and this on the head. Alright, so with that out of the way, the legs themselves are actually built in a pretty interesting way. See, the Harvester has a shell which covers a layer beneath it which is one penetration level lower. This seems to work as an exoskeleton, which hints at the Harvester's biomechanical nature. In a way, being something like the Striders from Half-Life, they even bleed when shot. To protect from this, the Harvester will deploy a large shield that deflects all attacks for a limited amount of time, or until sufficiently damaged. Shield technology like this is pretty common with Illuminate units, being seen previously on the Overseer. In this case, however, we can clearly see what generates the shield, that being this crest-like structure in the Harvester's head. When this is destroyed, it will cease to generate any shielding at all, allowing it for it to be most effectively taken down. The purpose of this I do not know, as we have seen in both warp ships and Overseers that shields can be generated seemingly without a blatantly obvious source. However, we may assume that the Harvester is this way because of how powerful this shield really is, easily tanking all but Hellbomb level attacks. It also seems that this structure is somewhat linked to the Harvester's beam, at least according to the Helldivers wiki. I don't believe I've ever witnessed this firsthand, but the wiki claims that when part of a Harvester's head is destroyed, its beam will become far more powerful, as it apparently worked as some kind of stabilizer. Again, I can't confirm this, so do with that information what you will. Aside from the beam itself, the Harvester does have an ability that it can use assuming that there is a target near it that the beam cannot reach, that being what the Helldivers wiki has defined as the Tesla Ripper. Basically, the Harvester has one of those Illuminate lightning towers built into it. Whenever a Helldiver gets a little too close for comfort, it gets zapped, only being thwarted by Helldivers wearing arc-resistant armor. The Harvester was once the most dangerous Illuminate unit you could encounter. Anyone who fought on Calypso will tell you that much. However, in modern day, it has since been, quite literally, overshadowed by our next unit, the Stingray. The Stingray is one of the units that utilize the Illuminate hover technology similar to the Watcher. However, in this case, it is used to a much greater extent. Somehow, with a process done that includes some kind of field in these circles, the Stingray can soar through the skies and strafe any Helldivers that it spots. And I word that very deliberately, as I also believe the Stingray is an autonomous unit, as it also bleeds all over its body when damaged, rather than specifically from what seems to be a cockpit that particularly resembles a ribcage. The Stingray will strafe Helldivers using what the wiki has dubbed the Plasma Destructor gun pods, essentially just really powerful plasma weapons on the level of something like the autocannon. I believe the wiki calls them pods because, as we can see up close, they have the ability to fold closed and open, and because when they fire in bursts of plasma that run in a lane of their choosing. For some odd reason, the Stingray is designed to telegraph this lane. Of course, this is a balancing thing for the game, but tactically it makes no sense. Additionally, I've never experienced this because of my superior skill at this game, but when you die to this telegraphed attack, you are completely disintegrated, which, as far as I know, doesn't happen in any other Illuminate weapons. This implies that the Stingray has a different weapon system than the rest. Overall, the Stingray is really not that complex of a unit, at least based on what we know, as it mostly operates on unexplainable technology anyway. However, we find that there is a lot more to say about our next and final unit, the Leviathan. The Leviathan is the largest active Illuminate unit that we've seen thus far, and subsequently the most dangerous. Now, it seems that this unit is made to resemble something like a trilobite, or more accurately, a member of the Xiphosaura order of arthropods. Now, while the trilobite may be the first image that comes into your head when you think of these guys, in truth, the last remaining member of this order is the horseshoe crab, which does somewhat share a resemblance with the Leviathan. We see that it's segmented in a way quite similar to the members of this order, and its shape somewhat similar. What most gives me this impression is its spade-shaped head, which also possesses a few important parts, the most prominent of which being what the wiki has dubbed the disintegration culverins. Each of these are equipped with a spotlight. However, this is more reasonable than a literal telegraph like the Stingray, as we could assume that considering that this is also an autonomous body, these partly double as eyes and may need built-in flashlights. However, they are not the primary optical appendages as it would be with something like the Strider in Half-Life, but instead they are secondary to the Leviathan's real eyes, a set of 4 at the very front which allow it to navigate airspace without crashing into buildings. These do somewhat resemble the eyes on the horseshoe crabs in most Xiphosaura body plans, and in keeping with that theme, it seems that these 2 holes on the sides here are also eyes. However, these in particular are compound eyes, verified by this horseshoe crab diagram. Aside from vision, we can infer that the Leviathan has what we would call an open circulatory system, or at least an analog to that system, where fluid in a cavity called the hemocell will bathe internal organs with oxygen. Because of this, there is no distinction between blood and interstitial fluid, and the combination of all this fluid is what we call hemolymph. And what's more, the horseshoe crab particularly uses a protein in its hemolymph called hemocyanin, which might sound familiar because it's actually the protein that turns bright blue when bonded with oxygen. That's right, it all ties together now. See, the horseshoe crab blood is in fact bright blue due to the presence of this protein, and the blood actually does have some, not much, but some applications in modern medicine. According to Maryland, like the state of literally just Maryland, a protein in the blood of horseshoe crabs can be used to test certain drugs and medical devices for the presence of endotoxins. Now, I know I'm stretching here, but it could even be assumed that Permacura, the company that makes Super Earth stims, could even be in the business of harvesting Illuminate blood for medical applications using that protein, in a similar way to the bugs whose blood have applications in power being a kind of oil. I'm pretty sure this concept won't be explored as much though, as it has never been directly addressed and the bugs are really the main focus when it comes to the resource side of things. On the topic of blood, when we peel back the Leviathan's tank level armor, we get absolute confirmation that this is a fully biomechanical specimen, with there being an absolute fusion of purple flesh and bright blue veins held together by rebar and wires. I really couldn't tell you about this thing's anatomy directly, as peeling back the armor disfigures the innards, but I could at the very least ascertain that something like arteries or the remains of vital organs can be seen around its midsection here and here when destroyed. Aside from any of that, all I can say that I notice on this thing is the variety of little prongs and appendages that I'm not sure the purpose of. I could assume that they are for something like noticing changes in the air or communicating with fellow drones, but aside from that, I have not ascertained a purpose for these. And so that brings us to the end of this analysis of the active units in the Illuminate. Of course, there are a few things that I have not looked at, including one slightly large one, but as of now, that one hasn't really been expanded on, and really only functions as a set piece for Helldivers to complete their objective. Overall, analyzing the Illuminate was definitely one of the more interesting analyses I've done, as for the most part I wasn't really able to extract anything meaningful from the technologies as I would have been able to with the automatons, as the Illuminate are far closer to magic than any faction. It's because of this that I really hope to see the developers expand on not just the lore of the Illuminate, but the way they power their systems and weapons, and on the way dark fluid is integrated into their technology. Hopefully in the future we get to see just what secrets the Illuminate are hiding. And with that, we reach the end of this video. As always, I hope that this video has inspired you to look at the organisms in the games you play under a closer lens. And hey, if you find something that interests you, send me a comment telling me about the game, and I'm sure that I will get to it. In fact, if you want to know exactly when I'll get to it, you can subscribe to my Patreon, where, among other things like early access content and shoutouts at the end of my videos, you will get access to my channel roadmap, so you can know exactly when I'll get to your idea, or suggest any changes. Additionally, if you want to support my channel in a way that doesn't involve a monthly subscription, you can just purchase a product tagged on this video. Finally, thank you to my current Patreon supporters, highlighting particularly Meow for being a high tier supporter. And so with that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye. So, what's next on the list? Oh, okay, so more biotechnology? Alright then.